Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to give people a few minutes to join the room and then we'll get started. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please add them in the webinar chat and make sure to select not just host and panelists, but everyone so we can have a good discussion. Welcome, Christopher. All right, so welcome to today's Tigerhall webinar. Our session features Nelly Wartoff, CEO of Tigerhall. Today's topic, how to build an AI-enabled transformation office. Nelly, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. And great to see all of you here. Feel free to join Christopher and Angela in the chat and share where you're from and say hello. It seems we got some Canadians in the room and we love Canadians, so big warm welcome. What we're going to chat about today is how do we build the AI-enabled transformation office. It's arguably going to be a bit of change, but change is part of transformation. So this is going to be about how do we do that from an AI perspective. And I always talk about always on transformation, and this is no news to any one of you. For those of you who were live in 2016, which I assume most of the people in the group were, compared to where we are today, it's been a very, very big change in just the number and sheer amount of change, right? And we're seeing this across the board, across industries, across the world, is just more and more and more change. So we've moved from having this ad hoc once a year type of change to this constant overlapping pipeline of initiatives. And entering 2026, it's, of course, AI is a very big part of this. And AI is not only driving the changes that we're seeing in technology. Of course, that's a big part of it. It's implementing AI technology. But the difference with AI compared to any other change that we've seen in history is that AI also changes our relationship with work and our operating models and how we generate revenue and how we serve our customers. So it's not the kind of IT change that the cloud transformation or ERP implementations or things like that were, right? This is much, much broader than that. So it's not an IT change, it's a full-on business change. And that's what is leading to this multi-compounding effect and just a tsunami of change. And it's not going to get anything less. It's just going to get more and more. And the good news for people in your role, in your professions, is that this burning platform for transformation is no longer up for debate. When I started Tigerhall 6 years ago, people were still like, huh, like transformation? Like, who does that? Like, what is it? What do those people do? Why do we need it? That was still very much the debate back in 2019, 7 years ago. But now that's no longer the question. And I'm not sure if some of you read the State of Enterprise AI report that came out from OpenAI in December, where one of the quotes was the primary constraints for organizations are no longer model performance or tooling, but rather organizational readiness and implementation. And people know this. This is not a surprise to people anymore. People are now like, oh, we have a lot of things to change. We need more and more change and transformation. So change management is actually more critical than ever to realize the ROI of these investments, right? Companies are pouring billions into AI. Last year, the number was 250 billion of enterprise investments in AI. And as many of you know, its ROI is fluctuating, it's inconsistent, and leaders are asking themselves, how do we get more ROI out of these very large investments that we've done? So continuing with that same report, the State of Enterprise AI report, one of the other things they mention is that there are clear differences emerging in how AI is used across industries and among individuals within firms. And this is the interesting part. Whether this gap widens or contracts will depend on how organizations approach change management. That is from OpenAI's report. So they identified change management as the critical lever for the organizations that will be very successful with AI and the ones who will be much less successful with AI. So they call out change management as a critical capability for organizations to get through this. There's also an interesting quote from Aaron Levy. He's the CEO of Box, which is a billion-dollar company doing content management. And he says companies will have to drive a substantial amount of change management to make this all work. And I think the next sentence here is very interesting. We imagine that AI systems would adapt to how we work, but it turns out due to their extreme power and inherent limitations, we will instead adapt to how they work. And think about that for a moment. We will have to adapt to how AI works. And just imagine the amount of change management that is, right? We're not talking about just implementing a chatbot or asking people to use a new technology or even just a natural language interface. We're asking them to adapt their entire working style and operating models and processes to how AI works. And that's both tactically and strategically and mentally, and everything is just very, very difficult around how you do that, right? So change management has become this super critical function. And again, like 7 years ago, when I started doing this with Tigerhall, people were like, what is it? And that was a question that change management professionals and transformation leaders got all the time. We're just like, what is it? Like, what is change management? Whereas the conversation in 2026 is, where is it? Where can we get more of it? Like, where is change management? We all need change management. That's the conversation that is happening in the world's largest companies right now. And 6, 7 years ago, it was like, why do we need it? Why do we need change management again? Like, why do we need this transformation office? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Whereas now leaders are asking, how do we scale this? We need more of change and transformation at a much bigger scale. How do we scale it? And then the question used to be about ROI, right? And this was just like 2, 3 years ago. A conversation and change was very much around what is the ROI on change management and how do we articulate the ROI on all the change and transformation work that we're doing. Whereas now it's shifted to how do we build this as an embedded compounding capability inside our organizations? So AI is not only driving more change, but just the nature of the change that is bringing about leads to these questions and shifts in conversations and shifts in debates, right? So I think this is a very positive move for the entire space and everyone who's in it, that it's elevating the importance of what all of you are doing every single day, which I think is incredible and not something that I expected 7, 8 years when I got into it. However, they say all of this, and you will probably see this in your organizations, they say all of this, but they act this. Have any of you met Mr. Manual Struggle? Or maybe some of you are Mr. Manual Struggle, and they put in place this one-man show, one-woman show who's going to be hiding somewhere deep in the organization in HR, reporting into talent acquisition, and just like, now, can you run our transformation program? Can you lead all our change? And this one-person show is going to execute their entire AI strategy. And it just does not work, right? And this is what we see again and again, like leaders talking big talk, but they're not really actually investing in it that much yet. However, they are looking at how do we bring this to a bigger scale? How do we do more of it without necessarily adding more headcount? So organizations are looking at scale and impact and building that underlying capability. Those are basically the goals that we hear every single day, is how do we get more scale of this? How do we build better impact? And how do we do capability? And underneath those three, you can build all of these three with either humans or technology, right? And as a CEO of an AI company, I'll be the first one to tell you don't do everything with AI. I think you should still do it with humans in many places. But however, the investments for headcount have been reduced massively, right? So it is really, really hard to get humans approved right now compared to what it is to get technology in. And I believe in a good combination of the two, where you have humans and technology working in tandem, where technology does the work that technology is best supposed to do, and humans do the work that humans are best suited to do. So that's the magic combination. So if we look at them with humans and technology in this context of all of this change is happening, we need more scale, impact, capability. We have limited humans. That leaves us with technology, right? And that's where AI can be so powerful. So think of it as AI for AI, and of course, all the other changes that you're leading to, but how can we scale better with AI? So what we're going to talk through today are these three phases of how you can build the AI-enabled transformation office. And the way I look at this is there's a phase one, which is about the AI workflows and basically doing what you're doing today with AI. And that's all well and great. That's a great place to start. And we'll dive into where you can get started and what's the easy way to set it up. Phase two, which is actually the most interesting and impactful in my view, is when you start looking at this from a decentralized change. and how AI allows you to build that decentralized capability. And once you've been through phase 1 and 2, that's when we then get into phase 3, where the transformation office becomes the context layer to change and transformation. And that probably sounds very out there right now, but we'll dive into what that looks like in the shift in operating model from a traditional transformation office to an AI-powered transformation office and what the operating model changes are. But let's start with AI workflows. And I think that's probably why most of the we have 250 people in the room. Most of the 250 people in the room probably showed up wanting to know more about AI workflows and how they can enable and deploy AI for the things that they're already doing today. So we're going to start there. And that is very much phase 1, right? Like that's where I would recommend you to start as well. And when we look at the different areas, this is by no means an all-encompassing overview of everything that a transformation office does. So take this as a high-level idea and like where you could potentially start. But looking at it across planning, execution, and analysis. For those of you who have started dabbling with this, I'm curious, and you can just put it in the chat, which of these areas have you started with between planning, execution, and analysis, where you started putting in AI, for those of you who have? And if you haven't, that's also fine. Planning, analysis, planning. That's so interesting. A lot of planning and analysis. We have 1 on implementation. All 3, love it, Michael. Planning and analysis. Super cool. So that's very interesting that a lot of you are looking at the planning side of things. So now a few, all 3. I actually think a good place to start, the best place to start is many times execution. And I'm curious for those of you who started with planning, the data that you had and the input that you had, and if you were doing it across like the documents that you were working with and in your own workflows and so on, for many that I'm talking to, the problem with starting with planning and analysis tends to be that they don't have the data. That's a very common conversation. I was like, oh, we don't have any data. We don't have any data to start feeding the AI, right? And for that reason, I many times recommend to start with execution, because execution generates the data that then you can feed into analysis. And once you have analysis, then you can use that analysis for planning as well. So curious for those of you who have done planning, which part of planning you've started with. If we look at things like change impact assessments, for example, I can totally see how that's a good place to start too. But overall, starting with execution tends to be where you get that data in the first place. But there are a range of different areas where you can implement AI, and we all know what it can be used for in terms of research and summary on the generative AI side, and then, of course, a lot of areas in analysis, etc. So many different areas that you can look into there. Out of all of those, one that I see as the most effective when it comes to workload reduction, and of course, everything you do on a personal productivity basis is effective too. But from a large, wider scaled part of like what actually reduces a lot of time and effort tends to be when you think about AI as the translator of your strategy to then drive personalized execution for the workforce. So the reason I think this is the most powerful is that it not only reduces your workload massively and reduces the effort required from the transformation office, but it also is a very big driver of adoption and overall outcomes of change. And that's why this is the AI workflow that I recommend to start with. Because when you think of, you have your strategy, you have the context for that strategy, and then any changes that come along with it, put AI into it, as that orange circle here, and then have AI translate that to your activation, to your adoption, to your reinforcement, because that is something that AI can do really well, is the personalization aspect of it. And when you look at personalization, right, and a lot of organizations are very challenged with fatigue and people are overwhelmed and it's hard to drive adoption. The reason I think this is so powerful is not just the workflow reduction for teams, but also the increase in relevance for the end users and the people who are impacted by the change. Because the moment relevance goes up, that very quickly translates to adoption going up. And that's ultimately what you're driving, right? And then fatigue going down as well. Because with these more and more changes happening, it's an incredible amount and load of change. The relevance for each person needs to be heightened. because you cannot just have the same amount of change, the same amount of things going out to everyone. So that personalization aspect is where I think AI is the most powerful, and really driving that personalization, because that aims to achieve the end outcome as well. So not just automating change management work, but actually driving the end outcome. In one case study, when we look at a consumer goods company, for example, we're doing this and looking at personalization. So they had this challenge of a lot of change saturation, lots of overwhelm, fatigue, very, very high key talent attrition. So when we look at key talent, it tends to be about 15% of the organization that are key talent. And they had attrition about 30% in that category. And they had a lot of change going on, a lot of different initiatives happening all the time. So they started with this personalization aspect. And what is critical and important in personalization, right, when it comes to AI is you feed it with a context. So the context, these are things you mostly have. So think of your strategy documentation. This might be your change plans, your impact assessments, what the initiative is about, etc. Then deploying AI to personalize that for each and every person going through the change. What does it mean for them? What are they supposed to change in driving that just-in-time enablement? Then the critical part of this is this feedback loop that drives further context and further personalization that then builds that over time. And when you think of feedback, is not just what people say or their comments, but like their sentiment, what are their personal preferences, how do they react to different type of changes, what are their different readiness and attitude levels to AI compared to a merger, compared to technology change and anything else going on. And then capturing that feedback that then further feeds the context. So with more and more feedback, you get better and better context. And context is really what then drives better and better personalization over time. So when we look at the wider scale of what AI can do, not just in your daily work and like the work of like change impact assessments or things like that, but rather how do you actually achieve the end outcome of delivering the transformation, delivering the change initiative that you're tasked to do. This is where I find it's the most powerful. And they saw things like 91% change adoption very quickly. They also measured confidence rate. So that was something they cared a lot about. Like, are people confident that they can actually take on more change? So one of those workflows that most people tend to think less of because it's end user impacting. But if you think of it as an overall transformation, this is one of the most impactful ways to start. And then coming to decentralized change. So regardless of how much we automate, how much we deploy AI in all of those workflows across impact assessments and planning and analysis, and regardless of how much we do, I still don't think there will ever be enough people working in change and transformation, right? So I think of that phase one, like, yeah, automate everything, deploy AI, do it better, and you can do much more with a smaller team. And that could easily be 10x. But if you have a team of 10 people today and say you can, with AI, you can do what 100 people can do with AI, 100 people is still not going to be enough if you're going to change how 50,000 people work, right? So I think the biggest power actually when we're looking at AI is to not get blinded by all of the just workflows and day-to-day productivity stuff, but actually thinking about how can we deploy AI to enable everyone to do change? Because this is the big unlock. And if we can unlock the entire organization to have the capability to drive change and transformation, that's going to be far more impactful than any kind of GPT or agents or anything that you can deploy in the transformation office. So when we think of expert to everyone, let's look at these three companies as an example to get to a little bit what we're referring to here. Does anyone know who these three companies are? Starting with the first one, which company is this? Logo recognition test. It's not Coca-Cola. Good, yes, right. And the C is Canva. And we have Justin and Lovable. Exactly. It's Stripe, Canva, and Lovable. What did Stripe, Canva, and Lovable do in their respective fields? What did they enable? AI design. Exactly. Anyone who wasn't trained in Adobe Photoshop, right, which is a complex software, could suddenly do a lot of design. Exactly. Maria, they make everyone an expert. That is the very, very big shift. So if you think of Stripe in payments, right? Before Stripe, some might not even remember when banks could be the only ones who could do payments. It was only banks that could process payments before Stripe. And then Stripe arrived, and suddenly everyone could process payments. Same with Canva. You needed to be a designer pretty much before you could do any kind of design, and especially using the more difficult tools like Adobe Photoshop required a whole course before you could do it. Canva, log in, put in your credit card, and suddenly everyone can design, right? So it shifted from designers to everyone. And then, of course, the most recent, Lovable. Anyone using Lovable? Curious about it in the chat. If any vibe coders in the crew here, because Lovable, what they've made, right, is you don't have to be an engineer to code anymore. Replit, good example, Justin. So Replit is a competitor to Lovable. So they've moved from you don't have to be an engineer anymore to now having everyone being able to code. So this big shift has happened many, many times before. And I think a big part of what AI is enabling us to do is how do we make this shift happening in change and transformation, right? And that's where we will really get to the scale that is required. Does anyone know Jevons paradox? Anyone heard of this? I'm getting into a bit of a like teacher mode here. No. All right. So Jevons paradox is interesting. It is basically from the Industrial Revolution. It's think of coal and steam engines and so on. There was a very big fear when these resources were made more available and more efficient and basically faster, cheaper, better, easier to use. Then everyone thought, oh, now demand is going to go down. It's going to be so much less demand for these because it's much more accessible and easier to get and so on. So we're not going to need as much coal. We're not going to need as much steam engines because it's going to be so efficient. So it's going to contract, right? But Jevons paradox shows that actually the opposite happened. And we're seeing the exact same thing play out with AI today. So what happens in Jevons paradox is that efficiency goes up. And if we think of what we just spoke about with AI making change work cheaper and faster, if you deploy it across planning, analysis, execution, you deploy AI across all of those workflows, it makes it a lot cheaper and faster. What does that lead to? Actually, the cost of change is going down. So you have much lower effort per initiative. So you can have 10 people doing what required 100 people or 300 people or 500 people before. So you're going to be a lower effort per initiative. This was exactly what people thought would then happen with steam engines and coal, is that since it's so efficient, demand is going to go down. But what actually happened is the opposite. So the amount of change, and this is my big 2026 prediction, I think the amount of change will increase even more when everyone can do it. I think demand will increase. So when more and more people can drive change, it's not going to be that now you can do these 10 initiatives much faster. It's actually just going to be more and more change. And I think the difference to Jevons paradox is that this is not only driven by more and more people can do it, but also by the fact of all the macroeconomic environment and circumstances that we just chatted about as well, right? So this means that more demand for change, we even more need decentralized change and more people are able to do it. And I think what makes change and transformation very, very ripe for this transition at this period of time is that if you think of what makes someone an expert in change, it's very much about you have some experience. There's a ton of certifications and frameworks and models and methodologies. And what companies have historically done is they think, okay, we need a change champion network, or we need 1,000 people to be able to lead change. We need to build this capability. What do? They send 100 people to pro-site training. And I think those days are over. And I think pro-site training is great, but I don't think it works for the current circumstances and the needs that organizations have. So instead of spending tons of money on sending all of these people to pro-site training, or I was on a call with someone earlier today who told me about she's doing one-to-one trainings with all of her change champions, and she's guiding a group of directors every week, and she's spending so much time manually with all of these people in one-to-one meetings. And I think that we don't have to teach people to do change anymore, actually. And I think this is the biggest by far unlock of AI, is that we can allow everyone to do change. Because if you think of it, if you can have every manager in your organization respond to 3 questions when you're rolling out an initiative, you're asking them, what does your team do today that they should not do tomorrow in the context of this initiative? So what do they need to stop doing? Second question is, what do they need to start doing? What do they need to do differently, right? So what should they start doing that they're not doing today? And then third question, what motivates them? What motivates to do that? What's in it for them? What do you think? And so on. Those 3 questions is something that an AI can ask all of your managers in your organization, and just have an AI bot collect that data and then execute that change. Because the beauty of the AI models, right, is that you can train it on the certifications and the frameworks and the models and the methodology. So whatever combination you've made of like ADKAR or Coder or like anything that you're combining and putting together, if you have your own model or anything, train the AI on this, collect very simple context and input from the managers who are actually the closest to these teams that many are now struggling to get close and actually understand. And that's how real AI enablement for transformation and change at scale works, is really when you enable everyone to do it. And having that as the underlying, so underlying the LLM, you have all of the methodologies, the frameworks, and so on, but anyone can interact with it. Anyone can do change. Anyone can just use the AI and deploy it with the correct methodology or framework or psychology or science that you want to apply it to, and just have managers do that. That's, I think, is the biggest shift in how do we actually build this capability. So it's not about fighting for headcount. It's not about sending 100 people to pro-site training. It's not about spending endless amounts of one-to-one time with leaders and try to teach them a methodology that is no longer relevant, right? It's about how do we make it easier? How do we become the Lovable, the Canva, the Stripe of the world as TMOs? And that's where I think we should spend our time. How do we as transformation leaders enable everyone to do it? Not just us. And I think the opposite is, there's so many that are like, you need this like credentials and you need to be an expert, and they put all these alphabet soup and abbreviations on their LinkedIn, and it's kind of like protecting and like making it more exclusive in a way. And I think we as an industry need to make it less exclusive, because we're standing in front of so much change in the world and everything will change. And if we're keeping that to ourselves and telling people that you need to go for a 3-day, $4,500 training before you can change anything, that's not going to fly. But we're all sitting on so much knowledge and understanding of how this works and how to make humans change. So if we can put that context and knowledge into AI and have the rest of the world do it, I think that could be incredibly powerful. And if I think of a company that have started doing this, not as much with the AI sense, but like have started decentralizing it, we had this US aerospace and defense manufacturer where the challenge they had was very slow adoption, very disconnected from corporate culture. So on this concept of decentralization, they wanted to make the transformation office just as invisible as possible. And I think that the self-awareness that this team had was just incredible. They had zero ego and all the self-awareness in the world to just go out and say that, well, let's just make ourselves invisible. And I think a few key things as you're starting to think about this is getting the governance balance right, and having the right way of like, what do you decentralize, what do you not decentralize. I like the analogy of, let's say we're going to Brazil. So, and where we're going is very much the decision of the C-suite, right? Or the CEO, like, okay, we're going to Brazil. Brazil is the destination. That's the job of the CEO, to set the destination. Then how we're going there, that could be the job of the TMO or the leadership team or anyone's like, how are we going there? Are we going by boat? Are we flying? Are we driving? Are we taking a train? Whatever. Then we decide as, like, say, a transformation office that we're going to go by boat. We're going to go by boat to Brazil. Okay, now the managers or the champions or however you choose to decentralize it, they can then still choose, do they want a speedboat? Do they want a sailboat? How do they want to decorate their boat? Like all of the things around how this boat looks and feels on the way to Brazil, that's up to the decentralized managers. So that's how I think of decentralization. And what I think this company got really right is that they didn't go and try and control how they decorated the boat and say that you need to do a speedboat, you need to do a sailboat, you need to do this and that. But they also didn't leave it to the managers to decide, are we going to Brazil or not going to Brazil? They're like, we're going to Brazil, but you can shape your own boat. So getting that balance right, I think is incredibly powerful. Prioritization, what's important, what's not important between different initiatives, what actually has to be done no matter what, what's mission critical and existential compared to what's like a good to have. And then a big thing that they did was they were spending their time coaching these managers and the decentralized change enablers based on feedback from the ground. And I'm calling this out because I think that was a big thing that they did different compared to, I've seen some others that do coaching, but they focus more on how do they want it to be done. So what's their methodology, what's their framework, follow this and that. Is very top-down coaching. Whereas what this organization did was they actually looked at what's the feedback from the ground, what's the sentiment, where are we seeing adoption and not. And the coaching was based on that reality. And that landed a ton better than coming with a top-down idea of how things should work and try to coach people into your way of thinking. So very much shared ownership, and to Jennifer's comment, and having these decentralized managers owning it. And speed was the main outcome. It went so much faster, and a huge reduction in the resistance related matters that this team were facing. And of course, a very big workload reduction for the central team and just enabling them. So this, what they're doing, they can now do even further with AI, right, and training. And it's also someone asking earlier the 3 questions. So what is your team doing today that they shouldn't do tomorrow? What should your team do tomorrow that they aren't doing today? And then what will motivate them to get there? So those 3 questions when it comes to the AI input from managers that you want to feed into as context building. Now, looking at the third one, the transformation office as the context layer. So this is really when you've done number 1, you've deployed AI in your workflows and your processes and so on, and you've enabled others to do the same thing. So everyone can now run change and transformation with AI support. Now the question then becomes, what is the role of the transformation office now? What are we doing when everyone is running change? AI is executing everything. Like, do we go to the beach and chill? Do we actually go to Brazil on that boat and just have a good time, have some caipirinhas? Or what do we do as a transformation team, right? And I think context here is going to be one of the main differentiators when it comes to how organizations compete. Because looking at the context layer is many times what AI is missing, right? And it's a little bit of when you think of consultants, for example, and a big reason why we have the love-hate relationship with consultants that we do in this industry is that they don't have context. So they come in, they're really good at what they do, they have great things to bring, but they don't have context of your organization, right? And I would think of AI a little bit as similar as to consultants in that context. Think of them as experts, PhD level, really smart, really good at what they do, but they don't have context. So when we think of the transformation office, the biggest role for the transformation office in the future, I believe, will be to be that context layer, to provide context of what is actually going on in the organization, what is important, coordinating across all the different functions and so on. Because every organization will have access to the same expertise and the same AI and the same models and the same kind of like expertise across those areas, right? But the differentiator is in making the right choices based on the context. And that's based on what markets do we go after? What customers do we serve? How do we make decisions in this organization? And what's the competitive advantage that we want to focus on and so on? And that context needs to go into everything that you do as a transformation office. So when we think of the transformation team, providing that organization context will be incredibly important. And the more you use AI, the more important it is to provide that right context. A big challenge up until today that I hear every single day is people say, we don't have any data, or we have bad data. So I still think that humans will have to stand in as context providers for quite a while to provide that context, because the systems in large enterprises are just not really great at that right now. Then looking at it from end to end. So end-to-end strategy, what are we doing? Making sure that it doesn't become too decentralized and people just do their own thing in different parts of the world, right? And then enabling these people that are actually enabling and coaching people, training the agents, training the LLMs. That's going to take a lot of time, and verifying output, especially in the beginning. Very important to have a human in the loop. And then being the feedback loop engineer. So when you get all of those feedback, and I'm not saying just like comments and words, but also like signals and how people react and adoption progress and things like that, optimizing the AI based on the feedback that you're receiving. So if you look at this from an operating model point of view, what we have in most organizations today tends to be what's on the left here. You have some form of strategy. This could be internal or external. Some of our internal strategy teams, sometimes that sits with an external consulting firm, working with the C-suite, decide what should we do. And then you have this trickling of initiatives, right? Where the C-suite decides, or maybe sometimes other people as well, these are the initiatives, this is what we should do. And then that goes to leadership, and then you cascade and cascade and cascade and cascade until it becomes a whispering game and people on the ground are like, what am I supposed to do? So this is the most common way that initiatives flow today. And then you have individual contributors generating data. Sometimes that goes to the TMO, many times it actually doesn't. I think TMOs have really bad data access in many cases still. So many times it goes to leadership to then put in some beautiful PowerPoint decks to report back up into the C-suite. So this is kind of the flow of initiatives and intelligence today. And if you think of those two areas, initiatives and intelligence, and design around them in that decentralized model, you really have each team doing their own initiative. So one team might have like 3 initiatives, some have 1, some have 6, some have 2. It will vary, right? It's not like all the people are exposed to all the initiatives and all the changes that are happening, but this will be based on what they are driving. And the TMO is then looking at enabling them and overall ensuring that they have the right context, that they have the right strategy. And the blue here is the AI. So feeding that to the AI, the central system that these teams work with and operate with. So that's a big piece for the TMO to focus on between the C-suite and between the teams, making sure that there is that enterprise-wide context. And then when it comes to the execution side of it and supporting these teams and actually making it happen, the enablement and coaching, I think we will still need for a while. Like humans are still humans, and we like humans, and we want to be coached by humans and so on. So I think that will still stay for a while to be that emotional support. And then training it. So if you have one central AI or LLM that does all of this where your managers are and they operate and run the change, training that, verifying input, verifying output, and making sure that that continuously improves, because this should be a compounding intelligence machine. It should get better and better and better over time. So having people who focus on that, and then going with that is this feedback loop engineering. So understanding how things are landing, how people are reacting, what leads to change, what doesn't lead to change, what works, what doesn't work, and then using that to further train the LLM and the AI that you have at that central part of it. So thinking of it as providing holistic context and supporting the people who are driving change, these leaders in the different teams, is how we think the future of the operating model will look like. And there are some companies that are on this journey already, especially in pharma. There are a couple of large pharma companies that have started going more towards this route of things. And they tend to start with the strategy and context providing and like moving more towards that while enabling the teams. And they're inserting more and more and more technology and AI to support this decentralized function. So many are on the road, but no one is really finished yet. There are a couple that I work closely with that I'm very curious about seeing where this all ends, probably by the end of the year. And if any of you are working on this, I would love to talk to you and see where you're at in the journey and see if we could potentially work together and support you in doing that work as well. So if you're up for being the case study on the first ones to shift to this operating model, then do hit me up and slide into my DMs as well. So those are really the three areas. And taking this to a close, when we look at how do we get started and how do we end up there, right? Because for most organizations, still that kind of operating model, it's still very far out there. It's quite new. It's not that many that are starting to think about it. So when we think of the crawl, walk, run across these three dimensions, the first dimension, when we look at the crawl, I call this scaled execution with improved visibility. This is very much the first step that I would recommend getting to. And that's why I found it so interesting that so many of you have started with planning, because I actually put planning in run. When you're able to use AI to effectively create plans and based on the input and historical data, predictive analytics, and so on, that's very much a run. So kudos to those of you who are there or maybe started there. For most, data tends to be an issue, and the fact that they don't have enough data to begin with. So that's why I always recommend to start with execution, because execution generates data. So it brings the data that you then need to do analysis. And it's only when you have real analysis that you can actually do planning. Because planning, the way that I look at planning is not creating a plan from your own ideas, but actually planning based on data and strategy and what you've seen in the past. So that predictive analytics part. So that's why execution is a good place to start, so you get the data. Then many are already running Change Champions Network. So thinking through how can you further enable them and move it closer to team ownership, where they take on more and more of those capabilities. But the way to move into team ownership is, again, to not try and make them change managers, right? But how do we make it easier for them to lead change? How does the TMO become the lovable or the Canva or the Stripe of change management? That's the way to move into team ownership. Because if you keep sending people to training or keep trying to make them ADKAR proficient or whatever you're trying to do, this is going to backfire. So how do we enable them to make it easier? And then once they're able to take that on, that's when we have the transformation office being true full-on enablers. And then looking at that context layer, many today still don't have visibility of cross-org intelligence. They don't have access to data lakes and the data that I think a transformation office should very much have access to. So a good starting point is making sure you have access to the data, you have it in a data lake, you can at least have that visibility, and implementing feedback loops. And feedback loops is not sending a survey 90 days later and asking people, hey, what did you think? But feedback loops is understanding in real time what works, what doesn't work, how do people react, signals and things like that. So it's not just what people say, but also how they behave. So those behavioral feedback loops is important to go into that visibility. And then once you have that visibility, that's when you can go into more strategy coordination, context input, making sure that people have the context to the overall strategy. And then you can pair that with analysis. And this goes together with allowing the teams to own more as well, right? Because if you can provide the teams with visibility and data and input, then they can much easier take that and run with it. And then ultimately, that's when you start getting into this whole piece of context engineering, feedback loops, and training the LLM when you have that central change and transformation AI that everyone works with when it comes to executing their change and transformation initiatives. And it's when you have that, when everyone is executing it with AI, then you can also get all the data back that then feeds into your planning. So they kind of go a little bit hand in hand across these three dimensions as well. But getting started, I would say probably 30-40% of people are somewhere here. About 10-15 are here, and it's sub 5% that are in this bucket at the moment. But I do think that more and more will be getting here because of the sheer amount of change and the nature of change. And we just cannot do it as a transformation office anymore. We need to start decentralizing it. And the unlock to decentralizing it is really making it easier, not making it harder. So wrapping with some areas how to not get stuck, because many people do get stuck with this as well. The number one problem is to be like, oh, we don't have any data. That's where many tend to get stuck to begin with. And that's why I keep emphasizing start with execution, because execution generates data. And then the data that you get from that, then you can start actually putting more workflows into AI, using more of the context, more of the input and so on. So execution is the driver of data. So you can start there. Some are like, we're already too busy, we can't change anything. No, just pick one initiative that you must do anyways, and just start executing differently for that initiative. You don't have to boil the ocean. Many people think we need to do all or nothing. You really don't have to. Most organizations that I've seen being on this journey, they really, really start with one initiative or one audience, and then they keep scaling up from there. Then leadership buy-in is a problem. Like, oh, we don't have leadership buy-in, right? In my experience, there's always one, at least one, hopefully more, but many times at least one that wants to be an early adopter, that wants to be an AI innovator, that wants to be seen as very gung-ho, and who would be open to you doing things a bit differently with their initiative. So starting with one of those and seeing how you can execute with that is a good place to begin. And then, of course, you have the ones who are just like, oh, IT doesn't allow us to use AI, then just go find a place that isn't planning its own funeral, right? I think that's a tricky one to overcome. Or have senior leadership that can then go and actually change the way that IT works. Because there are still those organizations, believe it or not, that go like, we don't use any AI at all. And that's a little bit like being back in 98 and saying that we don't use the internet. And I think we're far enough in AI now to say that shouldn't be the case for most organizations. In 2021, 2022, sure, there was some of that, but I think now it's a very, very established technology with very established use cases and so on too. So that shouldn't be the case. So those are some ways to not get stuck in this. So when we think of this holistically, and what we've looked at is building AI workflows and having that as that's a good place to start. And many of you are already doing that, so that's really great. Starting with the execution side of it, so you get that data. Then starting to think, how do we decentralize change? Phase 2 is really the major unlock. And that's why I spend more time today talking a bit more about that, because I think phase 1 people are pretty much already doing, but phase 2 is where I think the next great unlock is. And then once that unlock has happened, then moving into phase 3. So that's what I wanted to share. Always happy to dive deeper into any of these areas. I know this was very high level. As mentioned, I can spend more time on like the AI workflows. If you're in phase 1 trying to figure this out, hit me up. I'm more than happy to share more details on how you can get started here. Phase 2, for those of you doing this journey, very, very interested in sharing more with you. And if anyone is contemplating this phase 3 and that change in operating model, I would love to collaborate with you on a case study as well this year. So that's where I spend my time. What questions do we have from the audience?
Yeah, so thank you, Nelly, for the presentation. So here, I'm gonna start off with a couple questions. So we got one from Kitty. After you ask the managers the 3 questions and they are ready to change, how do you equip them all with the tools to get them started? The common question from them has been, how and where do I begin?
Yeah, so this is where that decentralization, like expert to everyone analogy applies. And this is where I think AI can be that enabler, right? So if you have those 3 questions and managers are in and they want to do this, then AI is actually where you can pre-train a GPT, you can set up your custom GPT, you can set up your own platform that does this. You can work with platforms like Tigerhall who operates and executes this. And there are many different ways you can do it depending on the level of where you want to get started. But having AI as that like in-between layer between that expert to everyone so that they can just interact with something very simple and you can train it from the back end to do exactly what you want it to do. But for the manager, it's very simple for them to interact. But you need to start with technology because otherwise it's still going to be humans everywhere, which is not going to help with decentralization at scale.
Awesome. We have a question from somebody who is remaining anonymous. So how are you getting truthful feedback, which requires trust, in low trust, burnt out environments?
How do you get, was the question about feedback?
Yeah, how do you get truthful feedback from them? So how do you get to the root causes, the root problems?
Yeah, so some of that is cultural, and there are some cultures that I've seen where feedback is just not shared, and it's hard to do something about it. What I have experienced in cultures that are maybe not at that like complete bottom of the scale, but a little bit more like how do we get more truthful feedback is one is of course like through managers, but also through different peer networks, and then also keeping a lookout for these signals. Because many times people wouldn't necessarily tell you what they're thinking, but they're acting what they're thinking. and their behavior will actually tell you sometimes more than what their words are saying. So I would look at behavioral signals and then corroborate that to what they're actually saying. And it could be as simple as seeing if someone is skipping through content or jumping into something or not doing something, but then they say, oh yeah, everything is great, but they still haven't done something, then that's contradictory behavior, right? So behavioral feedback, I think, is always more powerful than verbal feedback. And yeah, allow anonymity, as Miret says, that's a good one too.
Jennifer asks, how were results being followed, reported on in the feedback loop for the case study of the consumer goods customer?
How feedback was enacted on?
How were the results being followed or reported on? Like how did they get those results? How did we get those numbers?
Yeah, so that's what they were measuring. So if we skip back to that, so they were looking at confidence. So that was basically looking at set of different questions. So this second one was more survey based. Like, are you confident about this? Are you confident about the change coming up? So that confidence level was a survey based. This was based on behavior change and are they doing it in the workflow? So there were two major IT changes and then there were three major workflow changes. So they simply looked at all of those things that they were going to do different. So it was pretty process based, which is when it's easier to measure adoption, right? When it's process and technology. And that's what they looked at when it comes to change adoption. And then this key talent attrition, that's what we looked at over a 3-year period. And they looked at this as 15% of the population and then that reduction. And they applied about $300,000 to replace one person and looking at the difference there times 300,000. So that's how they got to the 749 million number. So it's a combination of things, but this is all data from them. Yeah.
Awesome. And Sherry has a question about, can you give us a specific practical example of how you would use AI at the execution part of change?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually think that AI is where you can do the most execution. So if you look at execution, things like taking that personalization example again, like putting context into an AI that then translates that into all the communications, the capability building, the training, the reinforcement, the guidance, all of those things, personalization can do with AI. So that is what leads to that high adoption. So I think this is the good place to start. So just dump, like it's as easy as like dumping your SharePoint sites, similar to what this company did, right? They had all of their SharePoint sites, dumped it into AI, can personalize all the change journeys there. And then it comes out as those trails that you can deliver to. And then capturing that feedback that further goes into content personalization. So I think that's a good place to start. You also, of course, have like sentiment, looking at these different adoption signals. That's another thing you can put into an LLM to get pretty good execution out of it. But I would think of when you execute change management, especially, it's a lot of communications, training, reinforcement, guidance. That's where I would start applying AI.
Awesome. So we have a question. Here. Sorry, I lost my screen. Um, so Rose is asking, would it be important for the why to be included in the goal from executives so that the right criteria can be factored in with a decentralized model?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that why is part of that context providing. So when you provide context to the AI on like what is important, like why are we doing this, that is very key. But I would caveat that with when it comes to the why for the individual teams, that's when you have the managers doing that. So you can have the why at different levels and have people like being able to localize it, customize it at their own level. And that's another good thing with AI, right? They can then take what's this overall strategy, deploy it in local markets, and increase the relevance for people. So I would say why should come at every single level.
Awesome. So we have a question from TechnoCM6. While I agree with the underlying thought that we may not need to send people to trainings or as many trainings, the question now is, don't we need to have people understand these principles so that we can continue to improve the models?
So some people definitely need to understand it, and the people in the TMO definitely need to understand it. So those people that are providing the training, like training them, fine-tuning the AI and so on, those need to understand it to be able to verify the output and ensure that it is adhered to those. But I don't think the general public, if you will, needs to know it. I don't think every single manager in a 50,000 person organization needs to know what ADCAR is, for example. I don't think that is necessary. But yeah, absolutely like the team of core experts to be able to train the AI, but not the general public. I think just like if you're using Lovable, you don't need to know how to code. Similar principle.
So, one last question from MC Cortez. Um, she says, or he says, "Wow, that was an amazing mindset shift on leading change. Would you recommend establishing an AI business unit or team to spearhead this?"
I do not. I actually recommend the existing transformation and change team to take this on and to build it in this way. Because wherever I speak with organizations that have like specific AI business units and things like, it doesn't really drive the enterprise-wide org-wide change that you need. Sometimes it becomes very us and them, and it becomes two different sides. And it could also risk then having, if you think of your existing transformation team, then having this AI business coming in and doing it to them. That's not a good change experience, right? So I would think of it from a change experience perspective of the people who are running this as well. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity to build and learn and set up this capability and build it from scratch. And especially for people who've been doing this for a long time, who've been doing transformation and change, then being able to set this up. I think it's a human thing, right? Like you don't need to be an engineer to do this. It's very much you just need to be a transformation person is actually the best person to set something like this up.
Alrighty. Do we want to do one last question, or are we
Yeah,
done
I
for the
think
day?
we have time. And just for Cassandra's last question as well, the three questions
Yes.
for the manager. What is your team doing today that they shouldn't do tomorrow? What should your team do tomorrow that they aren't doing today? And what would motivate them to make that shift or what's in it for them? Those three questions are really good context input for training a model that you use for AI. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. And I know this was probably something that some of you might not have thought about, or it's a little bit further ahead. But I'm always happy to chat with you and shaping this. And I too am learning as we go, right? Like we're all learning every day and seeing how it works in practice and how people put it and operate it and so on. So I want to learn from you. So all of you who are on this journey, please reach out, and I would love to learn what's working for you, what's not working, and how you're thinking about these things too. So please bring the debate and bring the conversation. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.